in the kit that has been distributed for the retreat, there is a feedback form. And one of the questions asked is, what are the key takeaways from this retreat? I think you will find it very hard to respond to that. Because what we have been through in the last 4 days cannot be reduced to takeaways, cannot be reduced to a few useful ideas that you take with you, leaving behind the rest. Because the nature of the retreat was to bring about a shift, a paradigm shift, a shift in our consciousness, our way of seeing the world and experiencing the world, and our values. And that will continue to unfold in the coming months. And you will find, looking back, that a series of changes still continuing originated during these 4 days. The impact of the retreat does not end with these sessions. The common theme, though, throughout the retreat was the idea of the birth of a new world, even as an old world is dying. The foundations of the new world are a new consciousness, which has not so far been active upon earth. But because it is something so new, with no precedent in history, the forms it will develop, the means in which with which it will express itself, are also not fixed. And so we have dwelt on the principles, the aspects and powers of the new consciousness, and some of the essential characteristics of the new world as it is unfolding and developing. But the specifics of it are still in process of being developed. And we are all a part of that. We are in an adventure in which the forms are still to be developed through us, even to some extent by us, but by the higher consciousness working through us and in us. When one looks at such a transition from a great distance, it is very difficult to describe it. You see a radical change, you see a sudden transition, sudden in evolutionary terms, but still radical enough to appear as something abrupt. But what it is like is difficult to describe, precisely because the forms are still in process of development. And when seen from within the old consciousness, one does not understand too much of what is seen of the new. The mother observes that many of the ancient seers, sages, mystics, saints foresaw this transition across various traditions. And what they saw, they tried to describe in the vocabulary they could express at the time. And when you read those texts, sometimes it appears somewhat scary. I have once, almost 20 years ago, compiled all the different things I could find. And I found that in every tradition there is something which is being described, suggesting a radical transition. In the Sufi tradition, there was a Sufi mystic about 1,000 years ago who declared that 1,000 years from now, when man steps on the moon, Islam will rise to its highest and then it will fade away. And that happened in 1969, man steps on the moon. In the early 70s, the oil prices skyrocket and all the rest follows. And today you find Islam in crisis. In the Catholic Christian tradition, similarly, we find a pope about 500 years ago. I'm sorry, I don't remember the names, but I have them written somewhere. He was a very mystic pope. There were political ones and there were mystic ones. And the mystic pope had a series of visions of the future of the church, and he wrote down the names. I believe it was 103 or 104 popes to follow after him. And then, when you follow the sequence, they're quite prophetic. Many of the prophecies have come true. The current pope is the last in the sequence, and there are no other popes after that, in his vision. Suggestive of some kind of a radical, sharp transition. It doesn't mean the papacy ends, it may simply be the power of the papacy wanes. The specifics are not important. He senses, he sees something, glimpses something which involves a kind of an end of what belongs to that whole idea of a religious lineage. In the Tibetan tradition, where the Dalai Lama is both the spiritual and the political head, there is an ancient prophecy going back almost 1,000 years, a few hundred years, which says that the 14th Dalai Lama will be the last. There will be no other. The current Dalai Lama is the 14th. He was asked when he visited Auroville, he was asked by somebody, is it true that you will be the last? And he remained quiet for a while and then said, it is possible. And some years later, he made a comment that if he has to reincarnate, he can come back as a woman if he wanted. And of course, as you know, the Chinese have already created their own Panchen Lama, their own equivalents that they select from their political system. And just that is enough to perhaps prevent a genuine incarnation in physical form because of the conflicts it would cause rather than the harmony that it would bring. We don't know. But the idea that this marks the end of a whole lineage of a religious structure. In the Puranic tradition, similarly, there are prophecies of certain types of transition. I believe it is in the Bhavishya Purana that they discuss transitional period when the humanity will go through a crisis, the air will be poisoned, the waters will be poisoned, people will worship criminals, put up statues of criminals and break the statues of deities. It describes the current situation where politicians are deified and you make statues in their name with their hands raised in blessing when the spiritual forms are set aside and so on. In particular, in the Vedic tradition, there is this idea of the cycles of development in evolution called yugas. They're not cycles as in repetition going round and round. It's a weird idea I find taught in Western philosophy and religious teachings about India. They say, oh, the Indians believe that time goes in circles. No, they don't. I don't know where they picked up the idea. It's the wrong idea. The journey of time has a cyclic development in evolution, but the time itself is unending with no beginning and no end. This is the concept in the Vedic tradition. And within that, there are cycles, and within the cycles are sub-cycles, and so on. And these are mapped out with great precision, mathematical precision. Some of the largest cycles are aligned to the rotational period of the entire galaxy. And then secondary cycles which go down to the rotational period of the tilt of the axis of the Earth precessing, which is about 24,000 years. And so the current Kali Yuga begins in about 5,000 years ago, when at the end of the Mahabharata. But Sri Aurobindo observes that there is a larger cycle and a sub-cycle within that. So the larger cycle of the Kali Yuga may span some million years, but within that is a sub-cycle of all four, and the first sub-cycle of the Kali within the Kali ends, leading now to the first sub-cycle of the Satya Yuga within the Kali. And he observes how The Kali Yuga is not just a period of darkness, it represents the focus on matter. And the first sub-cycle of Kali within that ending, the first Satya beginning, represents the divinized consciousness in matter. And that's the phase we are entering. If you look at the mathematics of the dates, the sub-cycle of Kali ends around 1907, and after that is a transitional period of 100 to 125 years. And of course, things don't work mathematically, they are indicative of certain rhythms. But we see this period beginning 100 years ago when all the old systems and structures developed by the mind are found insufficient. They struggle to solve the problems of human life, seem to be able to do it, at least promise to do it, and failed again and again and again. Laws break down, political systems break down, social structures break down. And this is the end of modernism. The modern age was the age of rationality, and rationality has failed us in its promises. Even science, which promised to make the world perfect by its means, has failed because it realizes it can give you the tools, but what makes perfect is not the tools but the people. And so we come to, through this transition from the modern age to what is described as a postmodern age, where modernity has failed, and now suddenly we turn to a kind of an inward subjective phase. Sri Aurobindo uses a more precise vocabulary describing this transition. He says, the age of reason, of individualism and reason, transitions through an intermediate passage of an age of subjectivism, leading thereafter to a spiritual age. Because when all external means fail, what do? You turn inwards to find answers within you. And then there is a first step as you go within, and you say, well, if everything externally fails, the only thing that matters is what I do, what I want. And there's a first appearance of a false subjectivism where I, me, and mine becomes the only reality that matters. The ego becomes the representative of truth. Of course, it's not true, and therefore that feels also. But if we continue to go deeper and not stop there, then we may discover deeper truths of the soul. And when the truth of the soul's spontaneous alignment with the divine consciousness, with the divine will, with its harmony with all creation and all reality, when that begins to come forward, and that becomes the true subjectivism that leads our life, in each one of us, spontaneously, we begin to fall into a natural rhythm of harmony. Spontaneously, each one expresses that which is true in them, and together we express that which is true in us. And it is this which makes the transition into the new Satya Yuga, the new golden age, the age of spirituality, the spiritual age. We are in this transitional phase. The Second World War was an expression of the false subjectivism. Sri Aurobindo explains how Germany at that time represented the highest awakened and organized consciousness in the collective in the world. And it was a power expressing such wonderful music, art, philosophy, science, leading the world in all these fields. The error was to stop with that superiority of the ego and to then assert the ego on the rest of the world and say, we are the master race which will lead, and push the others down into enslavement. That's what led to the deviation. But before that was a readiness, externally at least. The inner readiness was lacking, and therefore the error. And we see this pattern repeated subsequently in many other nations, including the United States of America, when it suddenly became the global policeman when the Soviet Union broke down. And the role it played at first was the ego of the nation dominating the world. Or China today, similarly asserting itself as the ego of the nation. And just like a human being goes through a process of playing around with the ego and then experiencing the knocks from life, beating down the ego, cracking it a little bit, forcing you to introspect deeper towards more true, so too nations go through such a process. Ideally, it could be avoided, but a little bit of it seems almost to be necessary. And the rest depends on how quickly we make the effort to go deeper to find what is true. The United States of America has something very beautiful to gift to the world, just as Germany has something very beautiful to give to the world, and China, and India, and every nation. But that must be based on its soul's character of the nation. And so we are passing through this passage all over the world where the egos of the nations are in a bit of a struggle, and the breakthrough will take place when the nations step back to find their deeper soul. Most topical right now is the Brexit, Britain exiting from the European Union. And if you look deeper into the problem, it's the same problem of egos unable to accommodate themselves. And through it all, the struggle of the soul of the European consciousness emerging to preside over the individual national identities, and in particular the ego identities of the nations. Yes, and there is such a thing as a soul of Europe. And this idea is not new, it existed many hundred years ago. I've had occasion to see a map of Europe as drawn by one of the early European mystics. It's drawn as a woman, and all the nations form together the form of the body, and in the center is the heart. And the center of the heart is Prague. Very interesting, very suggestive. When you look at the cultural elements which form Europe, they fit into this body so beautifully. And it is the same with America. There is the picture of America, which is this man, old man, pointing a finger at you and says, your country needs you when they took people for the World War. That's the ego. It's a dominating consciousness, very aggressive. But the spirit of America is a woman. And Sri Aurobindo refers to this when he was asked, what is the future of America? And he says, don't you know the three visions of George Washington? And if you look back, you'll find it on the internet. When he was fighting for the freedom to establish the new constitution and the new nation, a woman appears before him. He was a mystic, by the way, a Freemason and a mystic. A woman appears before him. She is the spirit of America, and she addresses him and shows him three visions of the future to come. And three times she addresses him as son of the republic. Very, very suggestive. And the first time he sees darkness coming from the east, attacking, and it is defended. The second time, darkness from the west of America, it is defended. And the third time, it is from all over the world the attacks come. And it is almost as if the nation may not survive it. And there's a descent of divine beings who come down and protect. It's all suggestive, all prophetic, and when you look at it in these symbolic terms, it's very difficult to make out what exactly it would mean in circumstances. But it captures what is happening in terms of forces, in terms of energies. And something similar when the ancients looked towards this transitional period and saw innovation. In the biblical tradition, there is a whole description of the passage which describes great destruction, fire and storms and things. But they could also be symbolic, they need not be physical. A period of great intense burning purification would be seen as a fire in the subtle sight. The same with Nostradamus and his prophecies, symbolically seen, very difficult to understand. Once an event is over, then of course you say, oh yeah, that's what it could mean. So Mother observes how all of these prophecies from the past, they glimpsed this transition. They couldn't quite make out how to describe it. They gave it a certain form which was natural to the vision and the capacity of the sight. And she observes the thing is done, the transition is made. We are already beginning the phase of the change after that. And she said, most people don't realize it. It's done already. We are through that. The rest now is only working out in external form. In the Mayan tradition, similarly, there is this whole focus on the year 2012. Of course, many people try to give it different meanings, end of the world. No, it was just an end of a cycle, a mathematical cycle. And of course, things don't happen because of the mathematics, they happen because of a change in consciousness. But the cyclic end was symbolic of a period of transition. There were a few others which I had seen also, interestingly. In the fossil evidence, in the archaeological evidence, we find cycles of events of mass extinction. When the dinosaurs last died about 60 million years ago, there's a series of cycles about 60 million years. Every 60 million years, there's some mass extinction. And almost 80% of the flora and fauna is wiped out. And after a short gap, suddenly an outburst of new flora and new fauna. 60 million years ago is when it happened. And so somewhere around now, in the current million years, it should be, if the geological cycles are to follow the same rhythm. But we find equally, there is another geological cycle. There's one more, which is a larger cycle, which also synchronizes around this point. But there's one more geological rhythm of the Earth's magnetic field, which, as you know, drifts a little bit over millions of years. But every so many million years, it suddenly flips. The north becomes south, south becomes north, and we don't know why. We don't even know how it's formed. We have theories, but nothing has so far has been proved with evidence. And the flip of the magnetic poles is long overdue. It could happen anytime in geological terms, meaning anytime. It could be tomorrow or in the next 500 years, we don't know. What we do know is in the last 15 years in particular, the pole has been drifting, the magnetic pole has been drifting and increasing in speed. Currently, it's moving at about 60 miles per year. The magnetic pole is shifting 60 miles per year and it's speeding up. And more recently, in the last 5 years, the tilt of the Earth has been changing. It was drifting in a particular direction, it has suddenly stopped and it started moving in a different direction and now accelerating, currently going at about 10 centimeters per year.
What was that?
The pole, physical pole of the Earth is moving, it's shifting. And so things are happening on the Earth which we don't understand fully, all suggestive of some physical, geological, let's say, transition. Whether it is destructive, whether it is gradual, whether it is, we don't know anything. We've never been around when it happened like this before. And no records of anything before. We don't even know when the magnetic field flips, it has to collapse and then reform in the opposite direction. We don't even know how long that transition takes place. But during the time that it collapses, all of the Earth, all of the sun's radiation will come straight all the way to the Earth's surface. And if it does, it will destroy life. If the flip takes place quickly enough, we have a little bit of trouble and then it passes. If it takes a year, it could wipe out a large part of life just from radiation destruction. We don't know. Now I point to all this because we see all of these rhythms synchronizing around the current period, all suggesting a change. The most interesting to me, though, is a more recent exploration done in the late 80s and early 90s by the US Army. The US government, the US Army, and the CIA developed a technology in the late 70s and early 80s, which they called remote viewing. You know, the army doesn't care whether science accepts or not. If it works, we use it. So they discovered that they could tap into people's psychic abilities to see things at a distance. And they began to train, to explore that and then train people to do it. And they discovered they could see in distance not only in space but in time. So they could spy on the Soviet Union, enter its secret facilities psychically, describe things not only as they are today, but as they are going to be a month from now or 2 months from now. And so they used it to very great effect. There was a group of almost 20 or 30 people that was trained. Many of them, after the program was officially shut down, they started their private companies, they wrote in books of the kinds of things they did. Fascinating. But I don't go into that. What is important there is, when they were looking at future projections, inevitably they would see something on the horizon, something massive, a massive event to come. And when they were asked to describe what it was, they didn't have right words. They could only see it as something so massive that it would affect humanity dramatically. Some of them saw images where they saw people on the battlefield while in battle, suddenly stopping, looking up, and then walking away from the battlefield because it made no point to fight anymore. What was it? Again, there are suggestions, but it's like those people who saw things 1,000 years ago. You glimpse something, but you don't know how to describe it. What is most interesting, though, is when the same people were tasked to view further up in the future. And then they describe something quite extraordinary. They describe an Earth where the environment is completely different. The extremes of the seasons have diminished. There is almost something like a constant temperature throughout. The variations are reduced, and everywhere the climate is comfortable, and people live in harmony with plants and with animals. The animals are friendly to human beings, and they live together and play together. Something so beautiful, so idyllic, that they found it moving. When this transition takes place, what is the duration of the transition? They cannot make out. But it is something imminent, it's right there. And what happens after is something very beautiful. And I find this fascinating because it is along these lines that the mother spoke when she described the future as the supramental consciousness becomes more and more overtly active in human life. I had intended to share this yesterday, but it slipped my mind. So I join it with the discussion now. The mother was asked, what are the signs that the supramental consciousness is working in matter? And she gave two signs. She said, first, there will be a change in weather patterns. This she said in the early 60s. She said, everywhere that there is extremes, they will become less. The extreme heat would become cooler, but the extreme cold would become warmer. So the ice caps on the poles melting is part of that. But the extremes of heat, where you have deserts, also are becoming cooler. A few years ago, I read a news item about snow falling in Dubai. And I think it was 2 years ago, we had a little bit of snow one day in Hyderabad. Surprising. But going in the same direction, when she was describing the construction of the Matra Mandir, she gave details of the Matra Mandir structure itself and then the gardens, and then she described a lake which has to be dug all around the Matra Mandir, defining the outer periphery of the space. And when you dig the lake would also supply water for her will. So she was very practical in the plans. But when you dig the lake, the mud has to go somewhere. And so she said, you take the mud and pile it up on the northern side of the Matra Mandir and create an artificial hill. And then on top of the hill, she said, you will plant fir trees. And this was to Huta. Huta looked at her in surprise. Mother, fir trees? And mother said, yes. With a mischievous smile, she said, because there will be snow. In our will. So you can imagine what it would mean for the world's weather patterns. If in Oroville there's going to be snow. And when will that be? She never gave dates because these things are fluid. The dates are not fixed, but directions are set. And what we see now is that they have recently started the digging process for the artificial lake. And there's a whole exploration of how to transfer the mud, whether to do it by lorry trucks or by a conveyor belt, which will take the mud. So they're in that process of doing it. It could be a few more years, perhaps, that the artificial hill would be ready and the lake would be in place. So again, the point is we are imminent in some kind of a major shift, gradual or sudden, is irrelevant now. So this was change of weather patterns was one important sign of the supramental consciousness working in matter. The second sign, she said, was a change in the human form. Remember, the human substance is the most valuable substance in the universe. Although seen from the large perspective on the galaxy, we whirl upon this insignificant globe, almost like a tiny grain of dust. And human beings, what is it? You can blow it all away in one little supernova, poof, and it's gone. From a certain perspective. But in terms of what it represents, in evolutionary terms, it's the most conscious substance in the universe, which is capable of aspiring for the divine and even is aspiring, at least in a few relatively small number of individuals, even if it's a million. And that is the most valuable thing. Because it is on that that the supramental consciousness can act most directly. Even if the most direct is through 2 or 3 levels of self-reduction, but it is still the most direct possible currently. And so inevitably in the physical consciousness, if there's an action, it must be in the human body, right? So what's the change she described? She said, the human form will become more and more androgynous. The distinction between the male and female form will become less and less. And she said it would be seen most easily among those who work on the body consciousness, who train the body as in athletes and gymnasts. Now you have only to look at the Olympic gymnasts and athletes, and it's broadcast on television, and you'll find it's difficult to make out whether it's a man or a woman. Isn't it? And there's something else that's happening. If you see among the younger generations, there's a sudden urge to make their body more shapely. It was not so strong in the earlier generations, but this generation somehow finds itself compelled to work on the body consciousness to give it a proper shape. And perhaps all of these are precursors of something which will become more and more stabilized in the human body form itself. But there are things happening which we cannot explain except by the action of the supermind in this case. In the ashram, we have the world's largest database of medical records of height, weight, chest, etc., of all those who were part of the physical education training program since the 1950s. All the medical records from age 5 to 95 from the 1950s till today are there. It's the world's largest such database. Recently, we put it all online, not on the computer, and to draw from its statistical results, we found something interesting. 2 things interesting. Across the decades, from 1950 to now, each decade, the average height of men and women is going up. And it's a clear line like this, steady. And it's not because of nutrition. Because the diet structure of the 50s and now it's not too different. And it would not explain a steady growth like this. For you, it should be the other way, steady growth. The other interesting thing was the average height difference between men and women is reducing. So we have 2 lines, average height of women is lower, average height of men is higher, and then the 2 lines are merging, they're joining together as you go higher up. Interesting. It's happening without anyone doing anything consciously, just by the pressure of the supramental force. Fascinating. And she saw this in the 60s, described it, and we find the evidence now. She spoke also of the human body becoming more plastic. We mentioned this yesterday. And she said, more than you can imagine in just 300 years. That's without doing anything. And the supramental force, when it acts, cannot act directly. It is a force which is infinite. You take a bowl and have an infinite ocean rushing into it, the bowl will shatter. So it has to hold itself back, reduce itself, make itself finite, limit itself, and then gently, because it's the power of harmony, perfectly, precisely, as much as is needed, as much as you're capable of, push at that moment. In perfect harmony with the push on all other things. So it leads to a rapid change, and the mother uses this phrase as rapid as possible without destroying. Now, if you observe this, what is it that could make it more rapid without destroying? What is it that makes it less rapid or compels destruction? Resistance. When there's a sustained pressure on a whole, let's say, a vessel from all directions to push it, shape it, when the more it resists, the more the pressure will build. And if it continues to build, it will suddenly break it. If you have to prevent breakage, well, you have to go as slow as necessary to match the resistance, just a little more, but not too much. But if the vessel says, all right, I accept and I don't resist, I give myself to you, then the same force can now quickly, rapidly mold it as far as the plasticity of the substance will permit. Right? If you take plasticine, you can shape it, but if you shape too fast, it cracks and breaks. And that's the whole condition in each one of us. We give ourselves as far as we are capable, and we're not too capable. But even having done that, the substance that is giving itself is itself still too rigid, too dark, too sticky. And so we have to work to make the substance itself more conscious and more plastic. The mother observes, Sri Aurobindo writes in the little booklet, The Mother, three things you need: consciousness, plasticity, surrender. You must make yourself more conscious in mind, in life force, in body. And every means is helpful. Start doing asanas every day. It will help you make the body more conscious. And do it with that intention, the way we described the other day. In with each stretch, feel and bring into the body substance and tissue itself that aspiration. Or some other aerobic exercise, but do it not as an exercise that people do this jogging in the gym with a television screen in front. Your mind is there, your body is, it's not useful for this purpose. Do it consciously. Do less, but do it consciously. Mother even suggests the exercise of making the body's movement conscious in ordinary activities like climbing the steps. You go up and down the steps, do it as consciously as possible. But put this as part of your practice for the physical body. And what you do in the physical body will influence the vital energies and the mind with no other effort. You can also work on your mind consciousness and your emotional consciousness to make it more conscious. And with consciousness will come the capacity to make more plastic. And so with the asanas, the plasticity is more obvious. With the mind, work on it. It's not something everybody will feel comfortable doing, but one of the ways you should do is to read Sri Aurobindo. Not a compilation, but the full book. Take something that interests you. The life divine, if you're more philosophically inclined, the ideal of human unity, human cycle, uh, future poetry, something major, a major work, not a short article, which you will study with the intention of understanding, to develop your mind, to make your mind more plastic, more open, to go through paradigm shifts with each reading. And he will do that. He will make you shift your perspective. Each time you read, I never saw it this way, and new horizons opening. Your mind will become more plastic, and he will infuse in your mind as you read the higher light. Your mind actually undergoes a change. Work on these things consciously. And the third, surrender. And the surrender is not an event, it is a state. I've had occasion to meet many people who say, 20 years ago, when I whatever, 40 years ago, I met the mother. I surrendered my life to her. But I find I'm having so many problems. You did something then, but you're not doing it now. It's not enough to be devoted. Surrender is an active state of consciousness where you open yourself to try to feel the divine will, give yourself, yield to the divine will, flow consciously to participate in the divine will. It's not something one can do constantly, but you can do it in brief periods, brief moments, as an exercise, 5 minutes in the day, in a conscious state of self giving. If you can extend it into an activity, beautiful. Do a work, a simple work, which you're sweeping the floor of your prayer space, arranging the table, wiping a few objects. But you do that in a consecrated action, offering your mind, your heart, your body, your actions. Short, brief practices, fully concentrated, even 2 or 3 minutes. Doesn't have to be half an hour. You can't sustain that concentration perhaps, but you can do it for 2 or 3 minutes. But a few moments like that will help you to align and to put yourself in that. And afterwards, when you lose yourself in your work and in your day, something of this mood will continue. Its influence will extend into the activities. And bit by bit, you will see some radical changes. The measure is always in how much you have changed. And when you experience the change speeding up, and so these are very simple practices, but they can lead to enormous progress very rapidly. Three things you must have: consciousness, plasticity, surrender. And that allows the divine force to act on you. Know that the force that acts on you is the mother's force, but it is also heard as the supramental Shakti. Of course, it would be a delusion to think that it is supermind working on you directly, because it cannot. You are a finite piece, it would shatter you if it worked directly. It goes through self reduction, self limitation to align itself to what you're capable of. I'll share with you a question somebody asked me once. Have you experienced a supramental consciousness? Now, it would be an error to say I have experienced its direct action. It would be an error to say that I have not experienced its action. So, the way I formulated the response, I said, supramental consciousness, which is infinite, limits itself into a finite ray, which we experience as intuition. That light then deflects or is reflected in the working of our mind. So every time you have a new idea, you have a new insight, you must know that behind it is an act, an action, an inspiration from the supermind. Every time you have an intuition which reveals something to you in a flash, it is a ray of the supermind. It is not the supermind directly, but it is the action of the supermind as a finite ray. And if you turn in this way, your whole life turns towards the supramental consciousness, towards the divine consciousness now working as a new force in evolution. Then it begins to suffuse your whole being from all directions. And it is towards this that you will find the mother leading us in some of her later talks, in her descriptions and the agenda. Knowing always, of course, what we experience is through those self-limitations, through so many reflections, but it is she, it is her force, her power, her consciousness, her omniscient knowledge, and her love. And if we hold this idea and begin to interact with all things in life with this constant sense of her presence, you will find rapidly it becomes more and more concrete, more and more vivid, and more constant. And you'll have the sense literally that she's carrying you, and everything that you do, everything that is done to you, everything that is done through you is carried by her. It's a very beautiful experience. At first, it doesn't last for more than a short time, but it comes back, and then each time it is longer and more frequent until it becomes constant and then grows in intensity and beauty and power. So, this would be a very practical form in which we could direct what we have glimpsed so far. But the point I wanted to get to was this: we are in a period of transition, seen in many different ways, articulated in many different ways. And the mother says it is one of those rare occasions when it is worth setting aside everything else, which are our priorities, and dedicating ourselves exclusively to this transition. Does not mean you have to give up your job, but in your job, in the work you're required to do, keep this in mind. And wherever you have an opportunity, make an effort to take those, push things a little bit further in these directions, because this is the future, inevitably. I think twice we read this passage, the passage where Mother says, if humanity does not consent to change, it will be through crashing circumstances. But a part of humanity which consents to change, and there's a part which does not consent to change. And so what we have is crashing circumstances, and yet in the part that consents to change, there is a constant protection that carries us through those crashing circumstances also. And we must hold that faith. Let me put it in this way. Externally, in life, on a global level, in circumstances, things will get worse. There's no doubt about that. But internally, if we are aligned to the divine consciousness, we will find ourselves carried like this, in her protection, led by her inspiration, intuition, at each moment to do exactly what is needed to navigate through the complexities of these circumstances. And we will come through. This is assured. We will come through because the purpose of the supramental action is to make this passage as rapid and as painless and smooth as possible. As possible. And how much is possible depends on us and our alignment to the divine will. But we will come across, and there will be increasingly the expression of this beautiful new world which has been glimpsed by so many. The divine kingdom upon earth. We can hold this in our aspiration for a while and sit in concentration for a minute.